Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back and welcome to week 8 in our series on Inside the Human Brain. And we're going to continue talking about burnout. And over the last 7 weeks or so, we've explored what burnout is, how it affects the way we think, sleep, and relate to other people and make decisions and whatnot, and what begins to happen when recovery starts. So today we're going to move from understanding recovery and the kind of dynamics of it on into how we might actually go about supporting recovery. So last week we explored the idea that recovery isn't this kind of switch, and people often look for this one thing that we can do. And we often find this in mental health in general. If your brain doesn't immediately return to normal, once that particular deadline passes or a demanding project finishes, or you take a week off, or a particularly difficult person steps away from your day-to-day existence. Today, we're going to take the next step in that. If recovery is gradual, then what actually helps it happen? So people, as I say, often search for that one big answer. It's a human thing to do, a holiday or the perfect sleep routine, or if I could just get my exercise routine sorted, or if I could go away for 2 weeks on a meditation retreat and not have my phone, that would sort me out. Something dramatic that we think is going to reverse months and years of pressure. And the research points to something a lot less dramatic than that, actually, but a lot more useful. Recovery appears to be supported by repeated opportunities for your brain and body to shift from responding to demands towards restoring depleted demands, depleted resources. Sleep is the big one that can provide one of those opportunities. Interestingly, movement is another. Supportive relationships can reduce the number of demands we have to carry on our own. And that's often one of the things that suffers very quickly during burnout as we begin to reduce the amount of social contact we have because we're exhausted and exhausted of contact, in fact. Everyday habits then can create regular boundaries between periods of effort and periods of recovery. And the important word here is not perfect. The important word is repeated. This is about repetition. Small changes will always trump sophisticated, long, big changes. So throughout the series, we describe burnout as this prolonged imbalance between the demands and resources that we have at any one particular point in time. And that same model actually helps us to understand recovery. If burnout develops when demands repeatedly exceed the resources available to meet them, recovery then requires the balance to begin moving in the other direction. That can happen in two ways. So you can obviously reduce the demands that have been placed on the system, or we can create more opportunities for resources to be restored. Sleep, movement, relationships, daily recovery habits primarily help with the second part, that is, creating more opportunities for resources to be restored. But restoring resources is not the same as removing the causes of depletion. And it's important for us to understand that. So, creating more resources versus removing the demands they're two slightly different things. So you can't consistently sleep for 7 hours and expect that then to completely neutralize an impossible workload. Or you can't exercise 3 times a week and assume it'll compensate for having no control over your working life. So the research again points towards this idea that workload focused and combined interventions can reduce exhaustion. Although there are some questions about the evidence there. But so today it's not about placing responsibility for burnout entirely on the person experiencing it. It's just about identifying the conditions that help recovery while recognizing that chronic overload must also be addressed. Burnout can keep your brain in an activated state at nighttime. If you've experienced it, you know exactly what that's like. Tired and unable to sleep at the same time, staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning. Sleep feels fragmented or broken or light or unrefreshing. And some researchers have followed people through this kind of post burnout period. And what they found was that after they use all sorts of interesting questionnaires and EEGs and polysomnography as well. And after 6 to 12 months of rehabilitation, burnout, the burnout group as opposed to the non-burnout group, showed significant improvements in several aspects of sleep. So they showed fewer arousals, less fragmentation, shorter sleep latency, that is the time to get to sleep, empty. And their fatigue, anxiety, and burnout symptoms then also improved, although they didn't reach exactly where the healthy control group were. But importantly, when people's sleep improved, obviously fatigue during the day began to improve as well. So you got this kind of positively cyclical effect. Now, it doesn't prove that improved sleep caused recovery. Sample was small, but it showed that recovery from burnout is accompanied by these changes in sleep physiology. And we know that sleep is an active biological process, not just this period when nothing happens. It's one of those periods during which a system that has remained active and alert for too long becomes less activated. And again, the focus being on repeated, not perfect, just repeated. And one that some people find quite surprising is the link between movement and the reduction of exhaustion. Again, some longitudinal studies looked at this, and physical activity was generally associated with lower exhaustion. This is one of those um, it feels slightly contradictory because when you're wrecked, the last thing you feel like doing is going out for a walk. But ironically, it's the actual activation which can help to reduce exhaustion. Now, studies use all different forms of exercise, different durations, and different ways of burning or measuring burnout. And there isn't exactly a precise formula for this. My feeling on this is it's the kind of movement that allows your mind to get what you might call an interruption of cognitive demand, something that will take your mind away, not something that distracts you like Instagram, but something that has some sort of a cognitive demand, which will take you away from the cognitive demand that is leading to the burnout. It might help you to disengage from work or increase pressure for this restorative sleep that you're trying to get and provide a sense of progress or mastery or some sense of control over what you're doing in your life. The useful question again here, and I can't emphasize this enough, is if you do go for a workout or whatever it might be, is not was it perfect, but rather thinking, is this the kind of movement or activity that leaves me feeling slightly more restored the next day than depleted? Again, the emphasis being on doing this over and over and over again. Again, one of those things that suffers early in burnout and then becomes part of the causal effect of the thing is relationships and our capacity to and our desire, in fact, to seek out other people. Relationships are often kind of discussed as if they're separate to biological recovery, but supportive relationships, we know, change the brain and they change what the brain and body have to manage. Again, there are lots of large scale studies which examine the relationship between what you'd call social support and the three dimensions of burnout. And support from colleagues and supervisors, for instance, was more closely associated with lower exhaustion. There might be a redistribution of work, or you might get more information, or provide cover, or reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty being a big source of threat for the human brain. Support outside of work, so non sort of peer support, appears to have stronger relationships with reducing cynicism and gives you a sense of accomplishment. And of course, friends and family, they're obviously less able to change the workload, but they can offer some sort of emotional connection or perspective or reminders about identity being separate from just your performance at work. Now, you can say all of this research is correlational, but we know that burnout makes people withdraw. Burnout makes you misinterpret offers of help or feel that accepting support in some way represents failure. This is part of the burnout process. The central point, however, remains useful. That is, recovery does not have to be an entirely solitary process. Sometimes another person becomes part of the resources available to your brain. So we don't see a relationship or peer support or social support as a separate entity to our biological entity in our brain and body. Social support is a very influential factor on that. One of the most interesting things I found over the last few days when I was researching this is in recovery is that the activity itself is less important than the experience it creates. So researchers have commonly described 4 recovery experiences. One is psychological detachment. And that's really just a fancy way of saying being able to stop thinking about work when you're not at work. The second is relaxation. That is a reduction in physiological and psychological activation. The third is mastery. You might remember we talked about losing the sense that what you're doing is good enough. So physical or one of the feelings you get around activity is this return of mastery, doing something that provides a manageable challenge or a sense of learning or progress. And the fourth is control, having some choice over how non-work time is spent. And something I would often say for this kind of switching off idea is I keep this phrase in mind: switching on to switch off. Switching off is not about trying to do nothing or distracting yourself on the phone. It's about being active in doing something else, switching on to something else in order to switch off from work. This helps then to explain why there's no kind of universal ticket to recovery, because it's how the experience is for you, and that's different for different people. You might find it relaxing, for instance, to go for a walk, and another person might go for a walk and replay an entire meeting in their head. You might find cooking a restorative process because, again, it takes your mind off and develops a sense of mastery. Other people might, like me, might find it a bit more demanding. Again, huge amounts of studies in this area with very big participant numbers, all telling us that it's less about the activity and more about what you are experiencing during that activity. So this, of course, is where the challenge is for us, is to look at our personal experience and say, what is it that gives me a sense of mastery, that gives me a sense of control, that allows me to engage with something else that isn't just mulling over that meeting over and over and over again. So that's where we have to personalize it for ourselves and reconnect with our sense of value. So I said earlier on, it's not about perfect. It's about being repeatable or being repeated, and simple and often always trumps sophistication. Small habits create repeated recovery opportunities. A useful habit reduces the amount of thinking required to create that recovery opportunity. So this is again about putting these systems in place. If I have to negotiate with myself every evening about whether I'll stop working or go for some type of movement or contact somebody or how I prepare for sleep, the decision itself, you're constantly having to make that decision. That decision then requires mental resources. A repeated routine, simple, easy, repeatable, not giant, not this complete and utter overhaul that we think is required. A repeatable routine makes the transition easier. The habit then becomes the signal that the period of effort is ending and something different is beginning. And we know that, of course, no one single habit will reverse burnout, but small, repeated habits reduce detachment, relaxation, mastery, connection, or control. And over time, then, repeated experiences may create better conditions for recovery than occasional, dramatic attempts to repair everything at once. Because again, if your goal is big, dramatic attempts to repair, they're exceptionally difficult to maintain those. And they then, when you can't keep it up, become another source of mental fatigue or a sense of loss of mastery or cynicism about your own capability. One thing I will say to people is to be very cautious about it. This is, again, it's like the catch-22 of burnout. People who get burnout, obviously, we are all driven and we want to do things and achieve things. But there's an important trap here, and that the moment that people who are burnt out learn that sleep, movement, connection, daily habits might support recovery, they can sometimes turn recovery into another performance project. Now they have to achieve 8 hours of perfect sleep, or complete a particular number of workouts, or meditate every day, or prepare ideal meals, or maintain a full social life, and monitor that then to within an inch of its life. And monitor, am I recovering quickly enough and linearly enough? And very easily then, recovery becomes another source of this kind of demand. And of course, that's the opposite of what you're trying to achieve here. Someone experiencing burnout already feels that they are failing to meet these expectations. And that then ends up giving you a longer list of expectations, which of course then is unlikely to help. So your aim here is not to optimize every part of your life. Your aim is to identify one or two conditions that make genuine disengagement or restoration slightly more likely. A 10-minute walk, that's 5 minutes in one direction and 5 minutes back, is still movement. A quiet conversation is still a connection. Going to bed at roughly the same time is still a useful signal, even if it's not perfect. Recovery should gradually create more capacity. It shouldn't become another test of your capability. So let's bring the evidence then to something practical. And this is the challenge to you all. The first question is not what healthy habits should I add? It is what is currently draining the most resources. Remember, we're separating out the active, the resources from the demand. What is currently draining the most resources? If possible, can that demand be reduced or delayed or delegated or shared or changed in some way? This is important because personal recovery strategies work within this broader environment that we exist in. They don't replace changes to workload or staffing or expectations or control. The second question is, which recovery experience for me is most absent? Is it detachment? Does work continue occupying your attention long after your workday ends? Is it relaxation? Does your body remain activated even when you stop working? Is it mastery? Has life become entirely about coping with no experience of learning or meaningful progress? Or is it control? Does every part of your day feel dictated by somebody else's priorities? Then, when you've asked yourself these questions, choose the smallest action that would support that missing experience. Small enough to repeat and small enough to complete on a very difficult day. Because recovery is rarely built by the most ambitious action that you can imagine. It's more often supported by realistic action that we can continue. Simple beats sophisticated all the time. So the three things to remember from today, I'll suggest these three. First, recovery requires the balance between demands and resources to change. Healthy behaviors may help restore resources, but they cannot indefinitely compensate for an environment that continues to overwhelm them. Secondly, sleep, movement, relationships, and daily habits, they don't all do the same thing. They create different opportunities for your brain and body to reduce activation, to disengage from demands, regain control, and replenish resources. And thirdly, recovery does not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. Small, repeatable opportunities, for example, to sleep more, to move more consistently, to connect, to mentally leave work behind, may be more sustainable than trying to transform everything all at once. Recovery is not about proving how disciplined you are. It's about gradually creating the conditions in which your body and your brain no longer need to remain on constant alert. So I've put in big blue letters here in the bottom of the slide. Reduce, that is trying, if in some way, a tiny way you can reduce the demands on yourself. That might be delegating something in the evening or part of your morning routine or one meeting or whatever it might be. Is there any way you can reduce the demands? Restore. Find what it is between connection, movement, sleep, etc., that is missing most, and find the smallest thing you can do to change that this evening. And just repeat that. Remember, simple will always beat sophisticated. So that is it for today. Next week, we're going to explore how to protect the recovery that I hope you'll have began the journey on by then. It's not about ensuring that burnout will never ever happen again. But once we do begin to make steps towards recovery, we make those simple, repeatable changes. How do we then protect your brain and protect your body moving forward and reduce the risk of burnout returning? So Shine for today, thank you very much everybody for joining us. I hope you get one or two or three little nuggets of information from that and we can help you on your journey. And I really look forward to seeing you all again next week. Again, as always, any suggestions or questions or comments, drop them over to us by email or in the comments here. And I'll speak to you next week. Bye-bye.